All right. James, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Duncan. Good to see you again.
Uh, One of the things I wanted to ask you about last time we talked was all about COVID. And of course, the CDC just released the new regulations on if you have the vaccine, you don't have to wear the mask in public and so on. Um, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that's long overdue? It seems like a lot of people aren't getting the vaccine for that reason.
Yeah, well, it's long overdue for who? I mean, if I was under the age I am, I didn't have all these sort of risk factors, old guy, fat, asthmatic, out of shape, all that,
Yeah.
then you'd be worried. Anybody under that, I don't know why, unless they knew they had a specific risk factor, why they'd be caring about this at all anyway,
Mhm.
especially, for kids. So I don't, it, the we did a podcast with Dr. Lineback, who's has 40 years of experience with this stuff, and he thinks it was just done to create economic chaos because none of the science that was coming out it wasn't really science. Do you know what I mean? The administrator of administrators, people like Fauci, who's I don't think he's seen a patient in probably 50 years. So
Right.
he's not even an administrator per se. He's not a scientist or a doctor really. He's a kind of a packager of the summary of political notions. And I have very good friends with a guy who went to school with him at Holy Cross.
No,
And
really.
yeah. And he said he always had like this little man syndrome, right? He was going to show everybody he was the best and everything, and really had a lot of chutzpah to carry him, and a tremendous amount of drive. And, we all know, people in science and work with NIH and other, and, in that system know that he's been chronically pissed off because he didn't get credit for curing AIDS or finding out what it was all about. And he was been very bitter about that. So he wanted to make sure that he was in control of this whole COVID thing. Here was a second chance at breaking his curse, if you will. Even though he's famous, he's still very highly ambitious person, and you combine that with a little man complex, you got trouble. So many of us didn't really believe what he was saying, and there's nothing to believe because he changed his mind so many times. Everybody can see this. And but also, the administrations involved. Everybody wants to take credit. The president administration certainly does for something they had nothing to do with. So it was everybody wanting to get credit as long as it turns out well. But it looked like to me and to several other people, another neurovirologist who knows everything about COVID and coronavirus is a separate person who just saw it as some sort of manipulation of people in the news to create some sort of chaos for political reasons. And so everybody I know in the know, and only one of them is a Republican. I'm not a Republican, but only one of them is, has any axe to grind that way, I guess,
Right.
but still knows. So it always seemed back in starting back in February, March, that something didn't sound right. It didn't sound like scientists and doctors talking at all. It sounded like some sort of, social experiment.
Well,
So that's how I still feel about it.
yeah, the weird part is I don't know if you heard about this, but this town recently in Massachusetts, it's one of the most highly educated towns in the country. And they voted to overturn the CDC's new guidelines on masks so that everyone walking around outside has to wear a mask. And
Well, because it's a political position. It's wearing a mask.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's an expression of who you are. You see, I'm one of the good people, and of course, I live right here on a University of California campus. So the people, I've got like 8 Marxists in my corner of the street, and I know a lot of people are leftists and kind of apostate liberals. And they're all walking around. It's hysterical. They're driving around in their cars alone with the mask on. they always, whenever they say something, it's always make sure to wear your mask and be safe and everything. Many of us go, what are you talking about? It's some sort of thing where you say, if you wear a mask, you see, this makes you one of the good people. And the people in the know. And it's this sort of leftist sort of, thing to prove. And it's a way, it's an identification among each other. You're one of the good people.
Right.
It's pretty hysterical. I see it every day, right? I see it all the time because I live with these people, and they're walking around outside, walking their dog with a mask on. It's like, I mean, even the young professors. So it's pretty. I think it's pretty funny.
Well, it has to be on some level a social signaling mechanism, because I would see posts by people like David Hogg, who's a gun activist, saying that, I'm going to still wear my mask, even though I've been fully vaccinated outside, because I don't want people to think I'm a conservative. And me, like,
there's some balls for you.
Yeah. But so as someone who understands the brain, what is going on in our heads where these, like, I've heard this, I don't know if this is an accurate way of saying it, people saying like being vaccinated and wearing a mask outdoors is like the liberal version of a MAGA hat. It's like you're signaling your political identity. Why do people even bother doing that? Like,
it's groupthink. If you look at it from a neuroscientific point of view, there are people who are, group or gang type of people, right? And then there are individualists. And so in the specific case, you can have people that are more, extreme on either end, can be thought of as kind of collectivists or group people. And they want to signal, for safety, and because they're wired that way. It's a kind of empathy. It's a large group empathy versus an individualist or a family type of thing, a smaller group. And so that has its own genetics, its own set of alleles that code for this, and its own brain connections. It's got a connectome of for these different kinds of empathy. So it's a kind of association that's kind of wired into people. But it's also for safety, because you're probably not going to get beaten up or robbed or shot if you're like by a Republican banker or a CEO. CFO, right. And because there's no sort of fear there, really. I mean, they don't do that. Whereas the other way, you're open for attack, certainly, as you can see every day. And so some people are scared, and so they identify with the group and hang with the group, and others say, "The hell with this," I'm my own person, and they don't do it. So there's a mix of things beyond the politics too, this sort of type of in-group, out-group empathy stuff.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I remember seeing a study like way back where they were talking, basically they had people who were liberal leaning and conservative leaning, and they did a test where the person sitting across from them would look away, and people who were more liberal would tend to follow people's eye movements, while people who were more conservative would tend to not look away, like where people are looking. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like you're just sort of
that is a political idea.
Okay.
Because you can be a group person and be a Republican and conservative, or a Democrat or a leftist. Yeah, you can. Now libertarians and real conservatives they tend to be individualists. Right. That's a different group. There's about probably 20% of people are that. But people, they want safety. They want to be part of a group. It's like you see TV shows that are very popular with the broad group of people, and it's always like, I'm one of the gang. This is my bar. I know these people. These are all my friends and everything. This sort of safety in numbers, and in a gang, or in a mob or a group. And so this has been going on forever. There's nothing new, and so it's not specifically political. There was that article that was written about 6 years ago, and it had to do with the amount of paranoia or something. And they said conservatives and liberals, but it really was, Republican and Democrat. It really wasn't, which don't always line up exactly the same, certainly. And and it showed a difference in the amygdala and more fear. And within 6 months, they had to retract the whole article. They had switched it. They had one of the students working on the project, and then they published it, but nobody ever read the errata, and it was a very uncomfortable thing, because it showed that the ones who were the most paranoid and fearful were what they call liberals. And so it's like many things, all you have to do is accuse somebody or put it out there, and nobody ever follows up or reads further into it, because we've all turned into ADHD animals with no, attention span or something, except for you and your listeners who, can sit and listen to something for an hour, but a lot of people, they just want boom, 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 especially younger ones.
I think a lot of people, though, are listening to long form podcasts. Probably the biggest podcast in the world right now is Joe Rogan, and he has like regularly 2.5, 3 hour long shows, and people listen to it, like that's one thing I wanted to ask you. Has there been any studies, or have you been a part of any studies where they look at changes in the brain based on like social media or, technology addiction?
Well, none that were any good. They were done. There've been several done by, marketing firms and by social scientists. And they really didn't show any brain things. They would infer certain things, but I've never seen a good one that would, take, genetics and imaging, put it together and really do an exhaustive sort of separation of traits to show that. I've never seen one that's done it that way. A lot of people get into this because of politics, right? They're like journalists. They get into it because they have a certain political position. They're no longer journalists. They're propagandists. But it's true for all the sciences I know. And there's always people there that use it for a political purpose. So I tend not to listen to them if I know that's what they are. And some of them are close colleagues of mine. I know they will have a certain way of looking at scans because of the death penalty, for murder cases. And because of a religious or political belief, they'll just say things they know aren't true, just because they're driven by the belief, by the emotional connection to a belief. And so in that way, it's a limbic, it's the emotional brain connection to things.
Well, but like what? Well, when you talk about the death penalty, what are they looking at that they know to be true and that they're saying the opposite?
Well, a couple of people I know very directly, because I know the scans, I know the people, and I know what they say, but they don't say it publicly, is that if you are against the death penalty, you will do anything to interpret a scan to make it look like that person, the devil made him do it. They had no choice in it, right? This is how it can be misused. The scans, it's like, the work I do too. And it's like, well, he really never had a chance because his brain is that way, and therefore he has no free will, and therefore he should not get the death penalty. So they will massage the results, the interpretation of the results to fit that narrative so they don't get the death penalty.
Wow. And it's unfortunate because I don't believe in the death penalty either, but even if people do have free will, I don't believe in it. That's
I don't believe in it either. I'm against the death penalty, but nonetheless, massaging data and changing all of this to fit what is driving you is that's a sin to me.
Absolutely. What do you think of, because you're a scientist, what do you think of the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga and his how he sort of got his tentacles into the scientific community and was giving people a lot of grants, and it seems like some of those guys were maybe there was a little foul play going on there. Did that surprise you at all?
No. And the people that hung with him didn't surprise me at all. These are guys being guys, right? Old guys going after young women. What's new about this? This one goes back. This is pre-Greek, right? Yeah. This is like the first problem women had. It's probably 500,000 years old or 1 million years old. And so, and he had enough swagger and the connections and everything, and he had the pitch. And so, no, it doesn't surprise me. This would be a very common thing. This is a sort of a Bill Clinton move, right? This is why people, most people study psychopathy saying the closest one to being a psychopath was certainly Bill Clinton, because he had no moral. There was nothing moral there. There was nothing really political. He was just trying to get laid, And but any guy can look at that and go, oh, he's just being a guy, right? But even this, it's really awful. But it's like people cutting people slack in politics and leadership because they think they're nice and they're not mean and they're cute and whatever. That's good for kids, right? If you're a teeny bopper, that's how teeny boppers get in trouble. But falling for that after you're 25, after all the synapses and all the monoamines are layered out in your cortex, it's like, what? Who do you think you're kidding, right?
Right.
But people still do it, and I understand it.
But why do you think he went after scientists in particular? Maybe he just had a genuine curiosity in science and wanted to fund it.
Well, I think he did. Many people, they have a genuine interest, but then all the other parts of their enterprise, well, and it ends up turning out very badly. It's like if you look at some psychopaths, they really get involved with working with the community and different charities, right. And they really mean it. It's not to lure kids in or anything. They really mean to do that, but they're also psychopaths who kill on some nights. So that firewalling is, I think, pretty common. So for Epstein or any other wealthy person, they tend to round up scientists. They bring them in on think tanks. And I've done a lot of this, right, up to that point. And they listen to your ideas, and then they may fund one of your students, or they then may see who you're working with, and your first thing works, and they really throw money at you. So it looks like a natural sort of progression of, got to get to know you, want to know your values, let me see your data, your first pilot study, oh, it's different, it's new, and then we'll really get into it. And that's a very common sort of progression. And I think a scientist could get into that quite honestly, and that person could, because they're just inquisitive, smart people, right? Yeah. But when the whole magic, when the magic sauce gets all put together, it's hard for some people to then resist the temptation, and you can slowly get into this. It's insidious.
And that's, you heard about Bill Gates is getting divorced. Recently, and that's apparently, at least they're putting out that, as soon as Melinda heard in the New York Times news stories about him and Jeffrey being together, like, well, why do you think a guy like of that stature wants to hang with an Epstein? Oh,
it's the buzz. It's like, why do anybody say, why did you really need that money? Did you really need to abscond with that? Did you really need to, you got the most beautiful wife in the world? Tiger, what's wrong with you? Or Bill Clinton? Well, that's a different story, but because people think they're looking for something cuter or better or more money, and that's not it. It's the hunt. It's the thrill of winning that hunt. So even when you've got everything, you still need the juice. As any addiction, you need a little more and more, and it's got some challenge to it. And I think I know some people make mistakes thinking that it's like a guy like that having an affair, or a guy like getting involved in some nefarious thing. He doesn't need it. Well, you're thinking like a normal person. You're not thinking about a super alpha who has to dominate and win everything all the time, and whose vistas become higher and higher. That increasing challenge and increasing risk reward is the buzz. That feels good. It's you're risk takers, good risk takers, and therefore they have to do one thing, which is always increase the risk while trying to win, and eventually everybody gets caught, right? But it's still a game. It's like a game like anybody. Why did you ski on that that triple black diamond when you really can't, even though you're working up to it? Well, for the buzz. And to say to yourself, I beat that. And if you're not competitive, if you're not like a superstar or something in anything, somebody would never get that. I'm saying I'm not, but I kind of can imagine this.
But it's interesting you say that. Like, I remember walking past, and I'm sure a lot of people have had this thought before. I was walking past this apartment with my friend, and there's just like a little ledge that you could easily get into the apartment. And I said that. And I was like, man, being a criminal would be so easy. And and it's like, yeah, but like you think about it, nobody who's a criminal is rational enough to make it easy. Like they're
Yeah, yeah, these are fundamentally different people. They have different brains. So when people always ask about TV shows or movies or something about the behavior of criminals, or in trying to, working with writers and producers about creating, true characters, or people just, talking to people about what motivated their husband or their wife or their child to do things. And they're always coming about it from the viewpoint of a normal person. Well, this is fundamentally off because they're not. They're not. Yeah.
What about when it comes to addiction? We've talked before about you had some studies with patients who had depression, and you were able to analyze their brain, do like a comprehensive scan, and determine what was the best treatment for them. Like some of it was SSRI, some of it was like a blue light when they went to sleep. Um, are there effective treatments for addiction?
Well, that's a great question. It's the most fundamental one. The only one I know of, and we have a startup company for gene editing for this specific question, and there's a convergence of connections and neurotransmitters in what's called the hedonic hotspot. It's called the medial hook of the nucleus accumbens. It's part of the striatum. And that's kind of, even though there's a full connectome network, that's a real center area along with some dopamine cells, how they interact and how those transmitters go. And, almost all addictive behaviors, all those addictive feed into that and release certain compounds. But, a fundamental part of the, just being a user versus really being an addict for anything is this additional thing about a stress hormone that's made in that part of the brain and in the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which is CRH. The corticotropin releasing hormone is the main brain hormone that reacts to all stressors, but it's also a transmitter in the brain. And when that's released in addicts, after they have stopped using, so after, they get up in the morning, either have a cigarette, and then they get the rush, and then the rush goes down and down and down until they get in negative territory. And then by the time the second, third cigarette or hit takes place, it's sometime in the day, they're not really looking for pleasure. They're trying to relieve the pain that's induced by the lack of the nicotine, for example. And the lack of the nicotine releases corticotropin releasing hormone. It feels terrible. It's like you've lost some loved one, right? And so it's that intense. And that's a genetic thing, whether you have that CRH variant and those connections. There's no known way of getting rid of that by taking a pill or, burning something out. But, what I have used and what people I know use all the time, which is not a drug, is a kind of self-cognitive behavioral therapy, which is every day. Every morning, you have to remind yourself, you say, you don't do this thing, don't do this thing. You got to keep reminding yourself during the day. That's either whether you're using people or, I smoke cigarettes forever and I still think of smoking. It's never going to go away. It's been 22 years since I've had any smoke at all, any cigarettes at all, but I still think of it every day and miss it. But I have to tell myself, you can't do that or you'll die, or you can't mistreat somebody. It's a bad thing. So this constant reminder, putting the little tape around, the little red piece of string around your finger, just to remind you every day in the morning, noon, and night not to do it. That's the only thing that works for me and other people. It's an important part of addiction therapy that is the CBD, along cognitive behavioral therapy, not CBD. Yeah. And so it's an important part of that. And something I prefer because it doesn't involve drugs, because I'm not crazy about drugs, because it sort of always ends poorly,
When you say drugs, you mean certain like treatment drugs, like methadone?
Anything, any drugs. I don't take antibiotics. I don't take, I've never had somebody drop me an upper once, but I don't take uppers. I don't take, sleeping pills or relaxants or nothing, even though, I have had panic attacks a lot of them early on in life. And I wouldn't take anything for it and just learn ways of manipulating my heart rate and blood pressure to control it without drugs. I come from a family of pharmacists who went out of their way, it was kind of taught this too. Went out of their way, the last thing you do, surgery. The second last thing is take drugs for anything. So I try to just let my body, along with some coaxing from either knowing some tricks, some cardiovascular tricks, or kind of a meditation, or this cognitive behavioral therapy, to get myself out of a bind, either for urging or for being sick. I don't go to a doctor at all. I hardly ever been to doctors. I'm surrounded by doctors, right? Physicians are who I interact with all the time, and they always think it's funny. But that's just a choice to avoid drugs and surgery, and actually physicians. That's probably going too far, but I do, even though my best friends are physicians.
Well, have you heard of Dr. Carl Hart at Columbia? I believe he's a pharmacologist, and he's someone who, talking about drugs and addiction, it says that a very small percentage of people, something like 5 to 10%, actually have it within them to become addicts, and that the rest of the population can use drugs ranging from weed to, in his case, even heroin or cocaine.
I don't know him, but I know the idea. That idea goes back to, and we studied opiates and other drugs starting in the transmitter systems back in the 70s from to today. So I mean, this is an idea that's been around, but now we know more with genetics in the past 15, 20 years that whatever alleles you have are really very determinant. And the fraction of people that have enough alleles for addiction is probably about, I would say it's more than 5, it's probably more than 10%. And then the ones, though, for a real problem, that also have that corticotropin releasing hormone variant that really drives you into being an addict, and about 10% of that. So maybe a little bit higher. And so we've always tried to figure it between 15 to 20% are addictable and the rest aren't. Now, we had a nicotine grant, a $40 million nicotine grant, and a $20 million large nicotine grants with NIH. And part of it was, the argument is that, in the political argument, because that the tobacco CEOs, when they testified before Congress, were not lying. They say that it's addictive. And for most people, these things are not addictive. They can take it or leave it. I have a whole family of people who can have 2 cigarettes a day and they never get addicted. Or people I know who take, like you say, heroin or something, they're not addictable. And of course, there's a whole group of people who want to scare you because they never want you to take any drugs, including your parents and churches and governments and everything. But the truth is that it's only a fraction. And people think, well, what if a big bag of cocaine? I said, I've had a big bag of cocaine in front of me. I don't take it. Yeah. They can't believe it, because they're, these are people who are users. So they think everybody would have to take. I can't take it. It's like that scene from A Bug's Life. Harry, don't go into the light. It's too beautiful. And but many people can take it or leave it, and they can use it. But it's not something. Nobody wants to make that some sort of official policy. Few people have the balls to say that, right? And even though we know it's true. And so it is, I don't know, 5% is low. I think it's more up 10, 15% are addictable and really. And so people go and get genetically tested early. And I put this in a book, the book 27 with Gene Simmons, from KISS. He asked me to write a chapter at the end of his book on, why rock and rollers and musicians, other people die at 27. And so I went through this, and especially about addictions and the development and the fraction of people who actually have this. So that's and it's in, accessible language, I think, in his book 27 is a discussion about the brain and genetics and development of this, and especially young people, from 10 years old up to 30.
I had heard, someone had said to me, that women's brains develop like are quote unquote fully developed at age 25, and for men it's like age 27. Is that true?
It's no, it's too variable to make, that sort of a conclusion. There's a really well-known hysterically and a very, very successful neuroscientist here at UCI. And he said that he was glad. He says the only reason I'm smart is because I matured so late. My puberty didn't occur until I was 15 or 16, and that delayed any sort of, a lot of synapses from forming, because the sex steroids, other steroids kind of fix the synapses and developmentally. So people who mature, the people who really, the guy was very mature. He was very smart and slick at 10 years old, and they turn out to not be so smart afterwards. It's the people who are the delayed nerds without this, the flood of hormones that become the really smart ones. And if you look at it in terms of, for women, it's different in terms of when it occurs, because more girls mature earlier than men. Okay, so there's the early part is done. The early part of development around puberty is set earlier in females, and then there's the final myelination all through the cortex, especially the dorsal cortex, in the 20s. And that can stretch out until you're about 35. Some people don't reach their full development until they're 35 years old. And that's when they're maximally cognitive, the smartest and everything. But then they may not emotionally be so great. And then you have to wait until your 60s until they balance out. Then you have a balance of a brain. So really the maximal brain is in the late 60s, on average. But for women, on the far end, there's too much individual differences, and the testing that's done are on different ethnic groups, because different ethnic groups have this different trajectory of development. So it'd have to be an enormous group representing all ethnicities, really, and ages. And that study to look at myelination patterns and look at what's called diffusion tensor imaging, DTI type of fMRI, and all of them, that's a $50 million experiment. So I don't know, we've got to wait until there are enough individual cases built up to do that, to actually answer it. So that's not been answered yet. So the answer to your question is that's not known.
Okay.
That finally myelination.
It's interesting, because that's like a common piece of pop science, is that your brain is not developed until you're 25. And then once you're 25, you're in. But
no, it's really more like 35. But anyway, 25 is the last myelination surge, if you will.
I see. What do you think about this trend of older men getting testosterone replacement therapy? And they seem to say I've heard people describe it like they felt like their energy and their, whatever drive sort of like dimmer, and then they got this couple shots, and then it was like, turned all the way back up, and they felt like they were 30 again. Does it have like long-term consequences? Is this the new normal? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I have friends, physicians that even do this, because they would say it's not only sexual. To me, I say, you're just doing it to get laid. Come on. Be honest here. Everybody says things, oh, it's for my health and it's for this and for my smartness. And if you really dig down a while and you get somebody hammered a little bit, they'll finally, whether it's a man or a woman, admit to you what they're really doing it for. It's usually to get laid. Okay. But beyond that, the loss of muscle mass, right, can be reversed with testosterone shots. Now, people take it orally and it doesn't really work too well. You have to, you need intramuscular shots of this stuff. And so a lot of people don't get that. So there is a placebo effect that if you take testosterone boosters, like the TV boosters, all of a sudden you feel more energetic. And that's probably in most cases a placebo effect, right? I'm going to do this and it doesn't last, but it's enough to sell people this for a year. There are dangers, of course, to using and anabolic steroids, sex steroids, on because it can make you really aggressive. Some people become very toxically aggressive. I don't know how good that is. Especially, you get in fights all the time, you get really aggressive and your bones can't take it. It's almost suicidal, but it's not pretty. I mean, the people who do this, it's not pretty to watch them. There's this thing about aging gracefully and maturely, but to have these guys all puffed up and really gonna do, look at me,
Yeah.
it's like, you don't seem like you too much, and it's, and you're not, and is it really working with the girls? Is it, and so, to me, I like a more natural sort of aging process. But some people take it, and of course they swear by it, but you have to take it by IM to really make it work.
And this is something that I wanted to ask you earlier. When you were first starting in research, was LSD still legal? Were people doing studies on it?
Yeah, it was legal.
Okay.
So psilocybin. Yeah.
Did you?
It's interesting. The guy that lived across the street from me was a psychiatrist. It was one of these MK Ultra guys who was a psychiatrist and was, pretty well known. That there were many parts of MK Ultra or MK Ultra type of experiments, right? They all weren't under that one umbrella, but they were very similar. The psychiatrists using all sorts of things, including drugs like LSD. And it was used by a lot of psychiatrists, and the CIA basically brought LSD into this country, and it was it was a part of that. The thing is, it doesn't work. The whole MK Ultra stuff. We're going to mind control. It doesn't work, yeah. But it's nonetheless, that's where a lot of this came in. A lot of people learned about it who may have been in Washington or other places where the experiments were going on. Like Ken Kesey and all these other hipsters. And so it was legal. And when I was in college in the 60s, people would say, oh, just do some acid and everything. So it was available, certainly.
What was it like? Do you remember when they made it illegal? Because I mean, there were tons of studies done. Obviously, it had a big impact on culture, and to just turn off the switch seems like it would have caused.
It was around 70. It was right. It was after I got out of college that it was made illegal. Yeah.
And okay, so were you able to do any research into it at the time?
I wasn't interested in it.
Okay.
I mean, even though the first thing I went in to was psychology and abnormal psychology at Rensselaer Polytechnic, I was, I got into that, but I wasn't so much interested in that because I didn't know enough about biochemistry, pharmacology, genetics at the time. I was into what most sort of a soft, it was physiological psychology, but nonetheless a bit soft. And it was when I then decided to go into more hardcore neuroscience and neurotransmitters that it became interesting, in the mid-late 70s. But I didn't, and I, work with people who work with LSD and collaborated, but I never brought it into the lab as something that I did. No.
Okay. That's when you talk about getting into abnormal psychology. I remember way back the first time we talked, you said how when you were, a teen, you'd steal cars and do all kinds of crazy things. Was that kind of sort of like the changing from being a witness to this to being a sort of a student? You see what I'm saying? Like, was that part of the drive there?
My mother had told me a couple of years ago before she died, and she was 102, and she told me of the stuff I used to do and that it wasn't exactly okay. And so I had to be kept busy all the time. But that started around puberty. It wasn't later at all. And it was just, it's thrill seeking. It still is. It's all about thrill seeking for me. And, because any cars we stole, we returned with gas in them, Simonized. Anytime we, it was fires, but they're always kind of controlled. And so anything I was involved in, we didn't want anybody to get hurt. Right. So at that time, it wouldn't be considered psychopathic. It would be, a guy, was screwing around, a mayhem person. And that was the intention, was just thrill seeking.
Yeah. And this is also back in the 60s, I imagine, where this stuff a lot more leeway, nowadays.
A lot more leeway, and there were a lot more people that were, well, there were more people doing things just for the hell of it, right? Just for fun, and did not have intentions for, death and mayhem and all of that, but like to see a fire burn, or like to jump in a car, steal it for a couple hours and then bring it back. And, or you go to a diner and, and bolt out of it without paying, but you really hid the tip and the money underneath. It was all just thrill seeking stuff. And it wasn't until I was able to get into a lot of football in high school and college, and then in competitive skiing in high school and then in college, that I was able to burn a lot of that off. I was too exhausted to do much of that on a regular basis, although I did in college and afterwards. It's just, to me, it was just fun. Now it would be considered completely psychopathic and or at least sociopathic, but not then. So it doesn't count, in that way.
Why do you think that kind of stuff starts around puberty? And why do you think it's more common, at least those kinds of things, for boys?
Testosterone.
Okay.
Testosterone helps fuel this, certainly. But you also, I think you need to be wired for aggression too. And we know there's a huge genetic component to just regular competitiveness and aggression. So you can have that and be very competitive and aggressive without being, criminal or really harmful. And then you start adding testosterone on during puberty, and you really get aggressive. It's hard to control. And then, so I think you kind of backdoor it through the juices, through the genes and the juices at that time. Now, but that's in people who had a normal upbringing. If you were beaten, abused, or abandoned or something very young, and you have this, then that's where psychopaths come from. Or if you're bullied, nothing like that happened to me. So I was very lucky. So I had all the basic drives toward aggression, competitiveness, mayhem, and all that, but it never had a cruel or mean component to it. I was never getting even for anything because I was not mad at anything. And part of it, I guess, was generational, because the generation before us, that short generation who are now in their late 70s to about 90, it's that small, right after the World War II. And these are the James Dean types. They're angry, but they didn't know why.
Yeah.
And so it was the rebel without a cause, and it was generally angry. And it was a meme, but it was a real group of people. All the beat poets were in that. And it was that was separate. But when my generation came in, I came right in the beginning of the boomer generation. I was treated well, and it wasn't really cool to be that, to be the angry guy who just goes out and have fights and because I'm mad, and people in my family, a number of them who were really loved and mix it up that way, were the older group, and they're like from a different family.
Yeah.
We live together. And so, you can't leave out generational things and what's happening socially. I know I tend to drive home the genetics and epigenetics and brain stuff, but there is a part of the narrative that certainly is in play. And that generation, you can tell them a mile away. They could be like 2 years older than me, or my group, and you know who they are. They're just angry for no reason, and they're kind of sullen, and they get in too many fights and all this stuff. And you ask them why, and they don't know. They don't really know.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Hunter Thompson talked about the Hells Angels, is that these guys who came back from World War II, and they were looking for someone to blame, and they didn't know who it was, but if you bothered them at a bar, then that night you were it. Like,
yeah.
It's I didn't know that about the greatest, as they call it, the greatest generation, that they had that within them.
Well, mine was the greatest generation, was the one before that.
Oh, really? Okay. So
This generation, this shorter generation, they were born about 1940, up till about 46. They from the mid 30s to 46, and they and so the greatest generation was the one before that, who didn't have this stuff, even though they went through it. And the poor ones were the ones, before that were the ones before the greatest generation who fought in World War I, who is, was such a damaged group and such a damaged world at that time. And that's where all this stuff really took speed, 1917, 18, 19, all this Antifa stuff and all the communist revolts and all that's when it really took up steam because of a whole convergence of factors that happened at once.
Yeah, I just talked to someone recently who spent a lot of time with Steve Bannon and was talking about how he's obsessed with this like theory of history history is cyclical and that we're entering a destructive phase, and that if we want to bring on, regenerate the cycle and get back to a golden age, really the goal is to just destroy as much as possible. What do you make of that? Do you see ourselves as being in a destructive phase of history? Do you believe in this cyclical history?
Well, there are boom and bust times economically, and there's a correlation with that. There are also pandemics that occur that correlate with this. There are also, over the centuries and millennia, when certain climactic changes occur, there is a spike in this stuff. And when they all come together, and they tend to, because of the change in weather pattern, the change in economics, the change in certain disasters, that all those metastable things in the culture will then crystallize. Whereas before they were, robust enough to resist this change. But the change isn't always the same. If you look at the major change would be back in the 1790s, 1800 French Revolution, right? Where you saw that, and that went completely overboard and wacko. And so all those leftists, then it ended up destroying France and a lot of Europe. And then there was a stretch of time that went to the 1848, when there was a whole series of revolutions, about 50 of them occurring simultaneously, and they were uncoordinated. But that was all of those were related to, first of all, the potato famine at that time, right? 1848 is a European potato famine, most famous one being in Ireland. But also on top of that, there was some radical weather at the time. And also there was still a lot of monarchy and colonialism. So the monarchy, the colonialism, and then also religion was considered to be very oppressive. So those 1848 things that occurred kind of spontaneously, 50 of them, that was the largest group of revolutions, and certainly in the history of Europe, I think, or anywhere, occurring at that year. But it was more for what we'd call regular liberal democracy, democracy and for working people. Mm-hmm. And so that was, but it wasn't destructive. There was also occurring a bit later, there was in France, the Franco-Prussian War, which precipitated a lot of problems. And then later, and also 1848 is the same year the Communist Manifesto was written, because there was all these things were happening and everybody had a different reason for it. So you had in the 19th century, people like Bakunin and Proudhon, and these were all different forms of, anarchy and socialism and with Marx communism. So these were all different flavors of a revolt, but a lot of it had to do with the monarchy and feudalism, and also the role of the military, the supreme role of the military in these countries too. It was a unique sort of combination. And colonialism and imperialism. So once you get to 1914, you have what was thought to be the best year they ever had. It was the best decade they ever had in Europe. Not only the weather, everything was okay, but it was, but there was a lot of pent up stress and anger and poverty, really real poverty. Nothing that people here would know anything about. But a real poverty. And so when that spark, and it could have been any spark, there it was, a Serbian, gunshot, just by bad luck. And then after that, after World War I, then you had, Germany and other people becoming very angry. And so that's when the communist revolt, the Spartacist revolution, where you had, Rosa Luxemburg, and we have Rosa Luxemburgs, AOC thinks she's Rosa Luxemburg. Tlaib thinks she's Rosa Luxemburg. Omar, all these gals think they're all, Rosa Luxemburg, or the next one, which is Il Pasionaro, which is the Spanish Civil War. But these are connected by the same people, the same ideas. So all the Antifa stuff, the communist revolutions, the anarcho-syndicalists, and all the flavors, it's got 100 kinds of communism, all started being created at that time. Now, it looks like a linear movement, but you can take the fact that there was a regular group of revolutions, but the revolutions were not the same. They were different. And so they look different to me, even though there's a fundamental background in what Steve Bannon is saying. But I think there has been a linear progression of this stuff. The one now with Antifas and the anarcho, because it always fails miserably. It's like 100 different major experiments and about 1,000 utopian communes that have been tried over the past, it's been 150 years, all ending miserably with a lot of people dying, a lot of poverty, and people why they think they're going to get some combination of anarchy and communism, and it just always blows up, because something that Marx was very negative about, and a lot of these guys, was human nature. They just didn't understand human nature. And the natural, they thought it was all from without. It was all social pressure. And once the social pressure and all these institutions were dissolved, then human nature would be this wonderful cooperation, which never happens. And so our summer of love, what was in 1967 with the hippies, that lasted 2 months. It's like most of them. That lasted about 2 months. And then everybody tries screwing everybody else's wife, and they fight over things, and it's, and they become very selfish.
Yeah.
And so it's just this denial of human nature. But I think there is a progression, if you really look at the parallel lines of thought and climate and poverty and all of that, these are qualitatively different from each other, I think.
It's interesting you say about the social pressure, because that was one of the things that Dostoevsky was famous for, that, in Crime and Punishment, the idea that was very prevalent, that if you just if you built the society in the perfect way, then people wouldn't want to commit crime. But some people just want to commit crime because it's just so they know that they can,
Oh, absolutely. It's a complete ignorance of psychology, psychiatry, human behavior. And that's what keeps killing these, with the anarchists, because there's so many kinds of anarchists too. But unless you're a pure anarchist, just no government at all, and they're never like that. There's always this. What ends up happening, of course, is all the different socialists and anarchists end up coming together because they find each other, because it always ends up being totalitarian. And the same things always happen, that they were fighting. And it's just part of the human nature that for some reason, socialists and anarchists, they deny it. And Marx never got it. A lot of these guys didn't get it. And if you go back to, kind of some of the genesis of this, to the 18th century philosophers, German philosophers, they tried these different formats and mutated into Marxism and fascism and Nazism, even though what they originally said was not that, right? And so it was a mutated jump, but still they had a fundamental misunderstanding. They thought, even the old guys, this 18th century philosophers, that if you took care of the environment, everything would be the same and everybody would be happy. And it was just, I can't believe there are still people who believe this, right? I mean, we have so much, we've got this, 400,000 articles written by all sorts of people around the world about human behavior and about the genetic basis of it, and now the epigenetic basis of it, and people's tendencies for mayhem and just selfishness that isn't because of poverty or oppression or anything, or gender. And they're wired that way, but there's still denial about this. I mean, you still hear it, and it's I don't know how much is willful ignorance, or they're just not. These are not the classes they're taking.
Yeah. Well, look, we're almost at an hour here, so I wanted to.
No, we're just getting going here, Duncan.
I know. Um, well, I wanted to ask you before we sign off here.
Yeah.
It seems vaccines are, well, they're here. Um, Mask guidelines are changing, but the COVID is still raging in many parts of the world. Uh, do you see a way out of this, at least for the United States? Do you see a timeline?
Well, we're already seeing, what is the mortality rate right now? It's really low.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, if you look behind me in Irvine, it's always been like almost the same as flu mortality, almost nothing. But if you go 2 towns away, you go to Santa Ana, where a lot of people live together, multi-generation living together, a lot in the service community. And that is, all this crowding like you find in India and in areas where there's a lot of congestion. People's lifestyles and the way they live together is very much like what happened during the plague, the European and Asian plagues, 1,500 years ago. The same kinds of conditions with tuberculosis also. So it's this congested living certainly adds to it. So that, how do you change that? Well, that is related to poverty, right? But some of it's choice. Some families, like I come from a Sicilian family, we all like to live together. We would, if we could, right? So, and nobody's above this. It's just that certain ethnic groups, certain kinds of families, they want to be together all the time. And they're involved in a lot of outdoor activities, outside service activities. That's where you see the high rates. And so to the extent that we can continue this, the type of gig economy that we have, right, which is online, for the people who can do it, it's going to only add to the decrease of mortality in the United States and much of northern Western Europe, and where people are young, people like in Africa, the very low rates of transmission, and because there's a lot of young people, there's more young people there, children, than anywhere, so their mortality is very low. So there's all these demographic and social and cultural things, but there will always be areas in the United States where large families are crowded in together and they live multi-generation in their service community, and they're always going to have trouble with diseases generally, including COVID.
Well, on that note, look, I wish we could talk longer, but I unfortunately have to go. James,
tell everybody where you have to go.
This I'm gonna cut this. I'm gonna cut this part out, but I'm technically at work right now, so that's I'm taking an hour in the middle.
You gotta get near retirement. Don't I seem to be having a good time?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that's.
I'm trying. I'm trying to build some web businesses on the side and pray to God I can.
Oh, I know you're a busy guy, man.
Yeah. But this is my 100th episode, so
that's great. Congratulations. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And so you've been on the show a number of times, and you're definitely, I'm putting out a top 10 of all my guests, and you're obviously going to be in there. But I just want to thank you for you've taken the time to do this show a number of times, and it's always been great. So it's been a real pleasure.
I always love talking to you. I never want it to end because you got a way with you, to evince and bring out answers that it makes it easy to talk, and it makes it easy for me to say foolish things. So that's great, right? It's got to have some entertainment value.
There you go. I don't think it's too foolish, but I'm definitely entertaining, and I always learn something. So we'll stay in touch, and thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. See you, Duncan.
Right. Bye-bye.